This is Father Bonaventure Chapman.
And this is Father Patrick Briscoe.
Welcome to Godsplaining. Thanks to all those who support us. If you enjoy the show, please consider making a monthly or daily or hourly donation to Patreon. Be sure to like and subscribe to Godsplaining and get your friends too to wherever you listen to your podcasts. Father Patrick, it's delightful to see you, but there's a third screen, as everyone knows, because they're tuned in for this reason. This is a Guestsplaining episode. We're very happy to have with us for this episode Dr. Kimberly Henkel, who is the co-founder of Springs in the Desert, a ministry we're going to talk about here. Dr. Henkel, thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm happy to be here.
That's great. A little background about you. First, you have a PhD in moral theology and ethics with a focus in bioethics, which is super important today, from the Catholic University of America. That's a great school. You teach fertility awareness methods to medical school students through, and get this, fertility appreciation collaborative to teach the science, facts. There it is, facts. Look at that. Was a former executive vice president of the National Pro-Life Action Center on Capitol Hill. So this is an exciting time for you as well, I suppose, given the recent justices' work. And has appeared on the Catholic Doctors Radio Show. That's interesting. Fox News, C-SPAN, CNN, RNN, TV. Okay. And studied in Rome. It's JP2 Institute, blah, blah, blah. Has 4 children and a husband. And is delighted to be talking with us as we are delighted to be talking with her. So fantastic. Dr. Henkel, we'll start off quick with Springs in the Desert. Springs in the Desert. This is, you're in biomedical ethics. What is this Springs in the Desert organization that you co-founded with your assistant, or your co-founder?
Yeah, so my husband and I both, we met going to the JP2 Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family. And
That's a
practical degree. It's speculative.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. It's a speculative and practical degree. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad you didn't meet him at the Dominican House of Studies.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We would go to mass there a lot, but no, he was not there. So we met, and when we got married, we had high hopes of having a large family.
Mm-hmm.
And, we were a little bit older, but we did not expect to have any trouble at all. So it very much took us aback to not be able to conceive. And it was heartbreaking and devastating. All of our friends were having children, our family members were having children, and we really didn't know anybody else who was having a hard time. So it just was a time of just feeling very isolated, and that nobody really understood what we were going through. So anyway, I ended up going to a conference, an ethics conference at Notre Dame, and I ran into a friend of mine from grad school from the JP2 Institute, and Ann Koshut. And I was telling her, we were kind of catching up, and I was telling her, well, my husband and I, we've been married for a few years, and we haven't been able to conceive. It's been really heartbreaking. And then she confided that she too was going through that same struggle. And it was just so wonderful to find like a kindred spirit who knew what I was experiencing. Like, we both were thinking, so just having so many of the similar thoughts, and just feeling like we had, both of us had really devoted our lives to serving God and the church. And we were really disappointed because we felt like there were no resources for us out there. Of course, there was NAPRO technology, and people talked about that a lot. And we had, availed ourselves to trying that. But, it doesn't always work out that a couple is going to get pregnant. And so it was just great to have that emotional support. So anyway, our friendship really developed, and we just became such great supports to one another. And in the end, I was asked to write a paper, just an academic article for Humanum, an online journal. And in the midst, I said, Anne, will you write this with me? And we were talking about just the need for support in the church. And at the end, we were like, I think we need to start this. So that's how Springs in the Desert began.
Okay. No, that's great. And I think the important part in this theological point, I suppose, is that suffering has to be borne with another. Suffering by oneself is too hard. It's too hard. I suppose that's the definition of hell. is suffering by oneself, but rather, and you've got Divine Mercy Jesus in the background there, which is fantastic. That suffering has to be something done with another, and obviously, ideally, and always with Christ. But he, of course, loves to have ministers. He has a body. He's the head of the body, which is the church, and we are members of that body. And so he ministers to us through these others. So as you say, there's something, and I think every one of our listeners and watchers can realize that when you're suffering, having someone else who understands or can walk with you and be with you, even without having any solutions, I suppose, is the first step. It's really important. So I love that image of the existential need for someone else to suffer with, to share that suffering in. Yeah.
Right. What comes to my mind is C.S. Lewis's quote about friendship, right? When you discover a real friend in someone that you're able to say, oh, you too, when you have that moment of recognition, something that you share together, that can lighten the load, is really an extraordinary thing. Could you say a little bit, I'm curious just about the name of Springs in the Desert, which is poetic and evocative, and your branding is lovely.
Thank you.
But usually when people do something like this, they don't take it lightly. So could you tell us what Springs in the Desert means? Yeah,
well, I think, you really get that sense of being sort of in a desert place when you are when you're suffering, like you said, just suffering, you just feel like you're out in the desert, and there is no, there's no life, there's no water, there's no, but also, there's the beautiful story of Saint Anne and Joachim, and here they struggled with infertility, and there was a time where they separated, and Joachim went into the desert. And so, I mean, this was actually sort of, the idea of Springs in the Desert sort of came to me, but then Anne is Eastern Catholic. She's Byzantine. And so they have a greater tradition with, the apocryphal with Saint Anne and Joachim and that whole story. And so there's that whole beautiful story of him going into the desert. And so that really kind of, for us, it shows how the struggle with infertility is not just the inability to get pregnant, of course, but it's also the struggle between the couple. And it can really be a crisis for that couple. And so in that story of Saint Anna and Joachim, they separated for a time, and Joachim left Anne and went into the desert. And it was just this time of just real desolation and feeling, isolated. So it's interesting too, when you were saying about the friendship thing, that's why we find that it's so essential for community, because a lot of times couples, even though the husband and the wife are going through infertility together, and it is a couple thing, the couple is going through it together. It's not like we don't like to talk about, whose problem, who's the problem in this, it's the couple. But a lot of times, because men and women experience grief differently, and they approach and understand this a little bit differently, they may have a hard time connecting with one another. And so that, again, shows that need for a broader community. And that's one of our main things with Springs in the Desert, is to help have the husband and wife learn to speak about this, to learn to understand each other, to learn that infertility is a real grief that they are experiencing, and that they may experience it differently, and they may not be able to communicate it, the same way to one another. And so we're trying to help them learn to do that. And, to go on with that, just that notion of the springs is, this community is really the spring in the desert, to be that support for one another.
That's right. Now, so this community, and when was it founded, or how long have you been doing this?
So it started in about 2019. Okay. And we wrote that article, and soon after we were asked to do an in-person retreat for women in Philadelphia. So we did that, and then we started planning in-person retreats, but then COVID happened, and it shut down all the in-person retreats, of course.
There was a thing,
There was this thing, and so we ended up doing a virtual.
We don't
Mother's
talk
Day
about
retreat.
that thing on our show,
right, exactly. Sorry, I know. I just, but we ended up doing a kind of pivoting and doing a virtual Mother's Day retreat that year. And we had over 300 people come from all over the world. And we realized, this is really this is a need. And so it was very beautiful because we've been able to do a lot of things virtually and have people join us from all over the world.
Yeah, I didn't know that story about Joachim and Anne. That was really interesting to me, Kimberly. But one of the resonances that I was thinking of is of course when Moses is in the desert, right, with the Israelites, and he strikes the rock looking for water. And I think the interesting thing for a lot of couples that I'd like to hear you start to respond to is that there's something like that contest with Moses going on, because at that moment, Moses strikes the rock twice in the desert, right? And, it was out of whatever insecurity, whatever doubt he was suffering, that he hit the rock twice to call forth water. Can you say a little bit about what couples go through with respect to their relationship with God, right? I mean, because you've mentioned the handling of grief together, right? And the role of a partner. And we talked about how friendship plays into this. But it seems to me that one of the biggest problems is that this is an unanswered prayer. I mean, what mother longing for a child hasn't taken to her knees, to plead with God for one? And you just hear silence from the heavens.
Absolutely. And that is like the fundamental relationship we hope to first kind of restore, because I think so many people feel like they're being punished by God. They don't understand. We see infertility in the Old Testament as a curse. And so we think, and a lot of people, I mean, none of us is perfect, right? And so we have pasts. And so I see women all the time, blaming themselves for some past mistakes that they've made. And that, this is just God punishing me. And so we first and foremost are trying to restore that image of who is, our relationship, the right relationship with our Heavenly Father who loves us so much. We can become just fixated on that sense that our identity is our infertility, that is who we are. And so it's, coming back to the source of we are beloved sons and daughters of God. He has good things for us. He has a beautiful plan of fruitfulness for our marriages. We may not see that. And so that's one of the things that we're trying so much to help restore that vision, that there is a beautiful plan that God has for your life. But first and foremost, you can't even begin to see that if your conception is that God is angry with you, he's punishing you, he's ignoring you, he doesn't love you. And so we're trying to show that is not the case. We have this, the beautiful sacrament of confession for our past, and that God just takes that and that he's not punishing us for our past. It's Saint Jose Maria Escriva actually talks about, he has this quote where he says, God has two ways of blessing a marriage. One is with children. The other, sometimes because he loves them so much, by not giving them children. And I don't know which is the better blessing. And that can just come as this. I mean, that's a hard pill to swallow for somebody struggling with infertility, right? But to see that, there's something like God is calling forth something from us. And so what is it? What is he calling us to? But before we move, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's, it's so the goods of marriage are traditionally twofold. The unity of the spouse and the procreation of children, with anyone who's gone through marriage knows. And these are related, of course. One gets married in the natural course of things in order to have a family. But of course, because of Christ, there's an inbreak in the kingdom such that even in the Old Testament, as you say, when that would be unblessed or seen as a curse or something, here we have, Father Patrick and I do not have children, will not have children. We are celibate for the kingdom. Jesus. So now, in Mary and Joseph are so that there's, in a sense, the goods of the marriage are also relativized within the message of the kingdom and God's love. Now, I suspect that it's hard to hear. So yeah, it's hard to hear this message, I think. So I'd want to know, again, sticking with with people struggling with this, I mean, what are the things that they need to hear, that you find that necessary, the things that they're most struggling with, like what, or there might be, I'm sure there's a general pattern to this. What do people that are struggling with infertility and are Catholics and therefore are wondering what's going on, and what do they need to hear from that you find is most helpful?
Well, first and foremost, that infertility is something to be grieved, because I think a lot of people think that you can only grieve like a miscarriage, a child who has died. But this is a legitimate sadness to grieve. And so a lot of people don't understand their reactions because suddenly they have a lot of jealousy or anger, and they're feeling like I'm very sinful for their anger or their, but a lot of times this is just part of their grieving process, and they don't even understand that as such. So that's one of the first things we say is that, this is something to be grieved. And, I think that they need to have people who come beside them and listen to them, and that are the presence, that are just with them, but are not trying to find solutions. I mean, Father Bonaventure, you mentioned that earlier. Just that can be one of the most difficult things, is when somebody, because suffering is painful. It's painful to be with somebody who's suffering, and you want to fix it, and so when you start trying to offer, well, have you tried NAPRO? Have you thought about adopting? It can feel very dismissive. And
these are all men that you're talking about. This is the standard, as mentioned before. No, I mean, men and women are different, right? Whether we're from Mars or Venus doesn't matter, but men and women, and such that men want to solve things. We just like to, in general, in general, men like to solve things. I mean, not that women don't like to solve things, but men, well, let's say in the more pejorative sense, men like to avoid problems and just get them fixed in a surface way, whereas women tend to dig down deeper on, especially relational kind of things. So when I hear this, have you tried this? Have you tried this? I immediately hear that in the voice of a man, this sort of like solving. I'm sure some women do this too. And part of it, I suspect, is you're trying to help. We want to help people. But if someone's suffering in this way, as you mentioned, it's listening and coming alongside them and just appreciating their suffering is the first step. And I think you mentioned the jealousy thing. It must be just impossible without grace to fight off vices of jealousy and envy that would be naturally concomitant with this real lack and this loss and this suffering. So I think having people not trying to produce solutions as if it's an easy fix, because that only, I suspect, makes the jealousy and envy worse.
Absolutely. We've actually developed a pastoral toolkit and on our website, and we also have, like 5 things I wish my pastor knew about infertility. And
we're going to get to this. We're going to get to this, but that's great.
Okay. But I'm saying because of that, sort of to help people, understand a little bit deeper, that these can be things. I mean, obviously you want to help somebody move away from being jealous and all of that. And you want to explain, if you continue to like nurture those, those things that's very sinful, but the initial, when it comes at you, when you hear another pregnancy announcement, the first initial response can be sadness. And then this sadness that you're like, why can't I be happy for other people? But this is very normal because it's just a reminder of the grief that you are suffering. And so we help try to, it's really important to try to redirect and maybe focus our attention on, praying for the child and for the child that's been conceived and not focusing so much on like the fact that I'm not getting pregnant, but, trying to process that. That's why it's so important, I think, to really process that grief and be in a community of others who are also trying to process their grief.
Yeah, and we should say this is, I didn't think about it, but infertility, this is multifaceted. We've been focusing on people who can never have or have not been able to have conceived children. But of course, in this community, I suspect you also have people who have had miscarriages, and then people who have had children who have lost them. This sort of thing. Like they're all people who, in some way, have been deprived of their children in one way or another. You could say. Is that so? All three of those groups would be in here, and they bring different. There's a similarity, I suppose, but there's also a difference with them. Are there any specifics in those three circumstances you could say that are important for people to know about?
Well, I did want to also mention secondary infertility is something else that people don't really think about, but a couple who's been able to have one or two children, or maybe even more, and then they can no longer conceive. And I'm constantly meeting people who are telling me, oh, we were able to have three, and then we tried and tried and tried, and we weren't able to have any more. And they really experience grief from that. And so we want to, welcome them, into the community. So we have people that have had that whole spectrum. I mean, absolutely, it is different. And so, we try to, for example, when we do a Mother's Day retreat, we try to address the different groups who've experienced these different losses, of course, but there is that underlying similar, just the rupture a lot of times in their understanding of themselves, like I'm broken. I can't do what I'm supposed to be doing. That rupture and that relationship with God, is he listening to me? Why is he not giving me what I'm asking? The rupture between the husband and the wife, just, not really understanding each other, feeling that pressure to time their relations together. Like, okay, this is, we're following, what doctor's orders, and we have to, and it can just take away the whole sense of love and the meaning of what what God has meant for that intimate time to be, right? So we see a lot of similarities in these different areas.
Yeah,
one of the testimonies that really struck me as a young priest was a scholar, a very prominent guy actually, who was talking about how difficult it was for he and his wife to go to Sunday Mass. So even the cure can be difficult to carry, right? Like part of the cure is to belong to a community. Okay, so we're going to be good Catholics. We're going to go to Sunday Mass, and what do you see at Sunday Mass? All of the other families with the young children, which you yourself are not able to have. So the cure, one of the things prescribed, right? Time for prayer, membership in the community, puts the suffering again at the forefront, just right before the couple's eyes. And I hadn't thought of it, not having been in that place. I hadn't thought of what that would be like for a young couple.
Right. That's exactly the case. And particularly if you talk to women who are struggling, the hardest day of the year, of course, to go is Mother's Day. And this is something that we have, we really try to speak about with pastors, the idea of trying, in the petitions to include couples who are struggling with infertility. In the blessing at the end of Mass, perhaps not having just the women who are mothers stand, perhaps, do the blessing after everyone in the congregation is standing. And then let's, make the blessing for, pray for all of our own mothers. Let's pray for the spiritual mothers in our lives. Let us pray for those who have mothered us, because, as Catholics, we have a much more expansive notion of motherhood, a real notion of motherhood that, there is this beautiful spiritual component that is so, it's not like the booby prize or whatever. It's like, this is actually the essential motherhood, is that spiritual motherhood that is so lacking. So let's draw attention to that. Let's talk about that. But my pastor did that this last Mother's Day, and so many people came to me afterwards. They were like, that was so beautiful. All the mom, it was just beautiful because everybody was already standing, and we were just sort of acknowledging all the different mothers in our lives and praying for blessings. And, and it was, it just.
No, I think it's the balance. Yeah, it's the because you could think, and we live in a culture, for instance, today where if anything's difficult, you just get rid of it. You don't talk about it. So for instance, I'm going to take an example. It's very different in any situation, but like there might be someone who's struggling with, gender identity and what pronouns. So what we're going to do is we're just going to not have anyone have Mr. and Mrs. Miss or any of the we're just going to avoid our dealing with things is going to be avoidance. And you could think that actually, like, once you realize, oh, wow, there are people who struggle with this and it is a real thing. You know what? We're just not going to do Mother's Day. We're not going to do a celebration. We're not doing it. And I think I suspect that that's actually really offensive because it's not dealing with, again, the grief and suffering. So walk through like the balancing of knowing that this is difficult, but how not to avoid it for both the pastors, but also just people in general, like, because we don't want to step on anyone's toes, but it's also offensive in a sense to like, when there's an elephant in the room, what do you do about it? So this kind of balancing that out, what would you say to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I think that's a good point. And we, yes, we want to celebrate our mothers, of course, and the tremendous sacrifice that they make. But I think that, just that's, I think just a broader understanding of what motherhood can be. And I think that's something that we try to do in our community is talk about, how are you being fruitful right now? Like, this is how we are asking couples, how are you finding fruitfulness right now? And a lot of times people, like, they will discount what they're doing. Like I met this one woman and she came to me in tears after one of our talks and just said, I've been trying to get pregnant. Now I'm in my 40s and it's not looking like it's happening. And I said, well, how are you finding fruitfulness in your marriage right now? And she said, well, my husband and I started this with COVID happening, we started this online rosary, and suddenly we have people like all over the world joining us. And she said, we're finding so much joy and fruit from this. And, and I was like, that is fruitfulness. Like, that right there is fruitfulness. And so, just trying to give that more expansive notion without, I'm not trying to take away like the joy of having a child. And we do something, we do talk about adoption, but not everybody is going to feel called to that. And so that is something, my husband and I, we have adopted 4 children and it's been beautiful, and you might be able to hear them right now. But it's, but not everybody is going to feel called to adopt. So, I think that it's important to, of course, speak about the joys of having children, but also being aware that there are other ways that you can experience your motherhood and fatherhood.
Well, I think the question, I mean, it's a tragic situation and it's a loss and it's suffering, but because of the cross, we do believe, although we don't always see the meaning in our suffering or the any sense of it. We look at Christ on the cross, and we think that suffering can be redeemed. There must be some, not to say purpose, but there must be some possibility of goodness in our lives, no matter how bad it is. And that's a message. It sounds so. What message of? I mean, I suspect you have messages of hope for women who are going through, and men, and couples who are going through this. Stories or messages of hope that even through this desert, there are springs of fruitfulness. What kind of message of hope do you like to instill in people or to remind them? Or are there any particular kind of images or passages or something that gives people a chance to say, yes, even though this will not pass, goodness will be found?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the fact that our marriage is a sign of God's love to the world, we start with that. And we have this one man in our community who, he says, I cannot imagine what my marriage would be like if we weren't struggling with infertility. He said, we are so close, like it has drawn us so much closer together. And so, we try to say, to look at the kind of the blessings in the midst of it, that a couple who does not have children can spend a lot more time connecting with one another and really kind of working through, when a couple gets married, there are so many, family of origin issues. There's all these different things that come into play, how to communicate with each other and how to really grow together in that oneness. And so there is that blessing of having that time to really nurture your marriage. But also there's this beautiful sense of this radical availability that a couple has to really see the needs in the world and to pray and ask God, where is he pulling them? Like, where are they feeling, we kind of tell them sort of, look back over your life and see how God has led you and the things that he has drawn you to, and really kind of press in and pray together and ask, where does he call, where is he calling you now? And so there's all these beautiful ministries that have started from couples who were unable to have children. There's just, we've seen, people being able to take care of ailing family members, of being able to start, different things that they just have that availability to do so that they would not be able to do so, with a lot of children.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's plenty more to talk about with this issue, but I think that's good to realize that you should have community conversations and Springs in the Desert is one of these places. So as we kind of close out here, Dr. Henkel, what I would say, so people who are struggling with this, who have not done anything yet, how can they get involved, or what ways they can get involved with Springs in the Desert? And then maybe with that, what kind of encouragement could you give them to do so in case, or what they might be feeling? You might say, well, they might be feeling like they don't want to do this, or they don't need to do this. So maybe an encouragement, and then a way forward on how they can get involved, how they could find you and these kind of communities.
Sure. First, a good place to start would be just to go to our website, springsinthedesert.org, and just check it out. We have a podcast that is, really
who doesn't?
Easy. Yeah, who doesn't have a podcast? But we have a podcast that, we had somebody said it was kind of like taking a friend with them, because, we have so many different people on the show talking about their experiences. So you'll find sort of a like-minded person there that you can feel like you connect with. So that's sort of an easier entry point. And then you can go and, we do this virtual Mother's Day retreat every year. We do a Lenten small group series. We have different touch points that you can get involved with the organization, and be a part of a small group, because that is just to find others that are suffering in the same way is so wonderful. Anybody who wants to can reach out on our website and speak to any of us on the team. We have this beautiful team of men and women, and so we're doing in-person retreats now as well. So we've been going around the country with various dioceses and going and doing in-person women's retreats and couples retreats as well. So that's another way, just to find others that are in your area. That's really great to find others in your area.
That inclusio kind of with you started with how this came about is that you were struggling with you're struggling with infertility, and you reached out and talked to someone and found shared suffering, and therefore produced fruit from that through this. And that to encourage anyone who is in the same boat, the first step, I assume it's hard to reach out and share this kind of thing because of all the guilt and the inappropriate aspects of in this area that you might be thinking about, like blaming yourself. But to do that, to reach out and to find someone in a community, whether it be around you, and this Springs in the Desert is a great way to organize some of that. So thank you for this organization reaching out and helping us to hear about something we don't always think about, and something that's hard to think about because no one likes to think about suffering and to deal with this, but that we're all in this together, and as we need help and assist each other, and to respect and love each other for whatever way that God is working in our lives. So it's a beautiful witness to us. So thank you, Dr. Henkel, for sharing this time with us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to all those who are listening to this episode of Godsplaining. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like, subscribe, leave a 5-star review or more. If you don't like not to donate, so if you'd like to donate to the podcast through Patreon, follow the link in the description. If you can also follow the links to the description to find our shop on Godsplaining, to find our merchandise, and any information about upcoming Godsplaining events. Please pray for us. We'll be praying for you, and we'll catch you next time on Godsplaining.